logical impossibility of having conflict within the European Union between states and the Union itself, because the Union itself has no its own sovereignty, but only some sovereign powers which were borrowed or somehow transmitted to the European Union. Well, I would agree if we stay within the classical framework of metaphysics and the Aristotelian principle of non-contradictory, which excludes contradictory within the being. Yes, I'm sorry for such abstract philosophical terms, but they are crucial. But the modern era was founded upon different metaphysical concept, that the being in itself is no longer self-identical, so that it is what it is, and it is not what it is not, as Aristotle pretended. But modern era is following Hegelian concept that being is what it is and what is not. Therefore, in the perspective of this modern metaphysics, or rather dialectics, the being is self-contradictory. It is based on internal contradiction. This internal contradiction makes it dynamic. Therefore, the existence of being is no longer static, but it is a process, dialectical process. Therefore, each entity, each being is existing through the internal changing of its identity, the dialectical process. And this is exactly what was said about the rule of law, the idea of the rule of law, which is the idea of modern political community, which is still evolving and changing. It started in the end of 18th century, the bridge of 18th and 19th century, with the concept which was correspondent to the constitutional monarchy. And today, it is ending with some supranational state, which is the guardian of human rights, etc., against the national states, which, from the one perspective, gave the beginning to this supranational structure. So supranational structure has no ratio without those beings, but in the same time it is living by the life of those national states, and it is sucking off this life from them and creating the existence of the superstructure. And if we take this perspective, we can see that it's not only possible to have internal contradiction within the European Union between the member states and the Union, but it is even necessary to have this contradiction in order to provide conditions for the development which will change the very essence of the Union itself and the very essence of the national states. So, looking from this very general perspective and in the background of some philosophical assumptions, we can see that this craziness, there is a method in this craziness. So perhaps we should not be so optimistic, I would say, saying that, there should be no contradiction. Indeed, the contradiction is necessary, I am afraid. And we are living in such a situation. Of course, we are trying to accommodate somehow, to not to get crazy about this situation, to somehow to accommodate to this situation. So we are inventing some constructions which could reconciliate this situation based on an internal contradiction. But this internal contradiction, I believe, is existing, and it is giving the directions for the future development. I'm sorry for such a long comment. Thank you very much.
I am not naive, so I know that there not only can be, there is a conflict between some member states and the Union, but this belongs to the political dimension. Now we are speaking about the theoretical or legal dimension. In legal dimension, it is impossible. If such a conflict arises, it means that one of the parties breaches its limits. For instance, we have a decision of the Constitutional Court which says that the binding force of the European law is based on Article E, the European clause of the national constitution. So practically, in Hungary, the European law is binding only because the constitution gives place for its binding force. Consequently, the European law on its own has no binding force. It's a secondary law. The original sovereignty, the original law-making power belongs to the member states, and the European law is only a derivation. So consequently, between the original foundation of law and the derivative part of law, so between these two entities, conflict in theory cannot appear. If appears, that it means that one of the parties, one of the entities breaches its limits. Please guess which is that. Thank you.
The identity of legal theory, whether it is describing reality or it is providing for us some narrative which makes us more comfortable in this uncomfortable situation, real situation. And I would say that this legal theory to which you refer is rather a kind of narrative which makes us easy and calm within this situation, which provide us with, but we've got principle of subsidiarity in the European Union. So national states are the most important, etc., etc. Please believe in this and go forward. Yes, and being in the good, and having such a nice imagination about the reality, we are moving forward, whereas the forward is Canyon, Colorado before us, and the reality is slightly different. So there is a question about the status of this legal theory, whether it is describing reality or it is providing us with some narrative which makes life more comfortable, but perhaps is not accurate in describing reality.
Almost every presentation touched the role of courts and the game of courts, which is a nice echo coming from the Game of Thrones. And if we mention another professor, now he's a retired professor in Hungary, Béla Pokol, who told us that practically we changed our form of government from parliamentarism to juristocracy. It's something which is together with us, coexisting with us just now, because the political debates between states, the political debates even more between member states and the European Union are going back to the shadow. And in the front, we have problems solved or try to be solved by the courts. And even the example of Romania, which was also mentioned by Professor Semkovsky, it's something very, very dangerous, because on the first level, on the theoretical level, we say that, of course, in the questions of European law, in the interpretation of the European law, the European Court of Justice is the apex court. Okay, but what can we do when the application for preliminary ruling coming from lower courts or judges of the lower courts has no connection with European law? For instance, if it happens in a simple family law question, and when it was supervised by the Court of Cassation, and after cassation, the judge of the lower court is not happy with the instructions coming from the higher court or from the Supreme Court, and runs to Luxembourg and asks whether the instruction of the Supreme Court is in line with the correct interpretation of the European law. So practically it mismatches everything. And this is, I'm afraid, not a question of coexistence, it's a question of federalism. So I have to agree. And if we read some very, very new decisions of the European Court, or both of European courts, we became more and more afraid of that. Thank you.